Good morning. We thought we
First, we got to knock off the general thing.
We'll knock off the general thing, Dick. Thank you. Good morning. We're pleased to be here. We're actually a little new, both of us.
Both of us are newbies, yes.
To the council. We're happy to be here. And we're going to actually focus our conversation on thinking about how we do the connections that the Academy has to the different groups that are here in the audience today. And we basically connect, we think, in three basic ways. First, through the research that we do, and often do with the partners that are represented in this room. Second, in terms of the teaching and education, the students that we are producing that are hopefully filling up your organizations and our country in terms of being both good citizens and employees. And in the third area that we believe, both of us, the Academy has a very important role, is actually in our contributions to the economy. And that also relates to the topic that we're talking about today. We thought we'd focus on two different things. One is a specific example through threats, and the second is a conversation around partnership. And so with that, we thought we'd start around the threat issue, and this threat space is actually a space that we both have had an opportunity in our previous lives and our current lives to spend time on and work on. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
So partnerships, we were thinking about partnerships in sort of three ways. One is partnerships among our own schools or colleges on a campus, and I think everybody here that's in academia knows we're pretty proud of our silos. So just developing the templates to work that part. Then partnerships with the private sector and the public sector, of which we've both had a little experience in, and I think we ought to talk a little bit more probably about that, Sylvia, in terms of how do we encourage those partnerships on our own campuses, which we have some great examples of success, but it's often like it's just really tedious to try to get people to cooperate in ways. I'm reminded of a story or a situation that Sam Allen is the CEO and chair of Deere Corporation. When I was on the board, we were talking about senior leadership, and Sam made it very clear that rule number one is Deere, that no matter what sector you're in, if you're in ag or if you're in the lawn mowing stuff, or if you're in construction, as leaders, you're expected to cooperate with one another regardless of the bottom line and the rest of that. You're just supposed to make Deere work for Deere and for its customers. And if we could just say something like that, well, we say it on campus all the time, but if you could have the same impact that Sam had on his senior leadership team, which is a very cohesive and a team that's really willing to work with each other and partner in so many different ways.
And as we think about partners and partnerships and the experience and some sort of grounding principles that I think applicable for universities, applicable for as you're entering in with the private sector, thinking about establishing clearly what are the goals of the partnership. When you come together and go ahead and can both sides write down, here's what we think are the goals of this partnership, and the other side. And what you have to have is enough of that Venn diagram so that you have overlap in terms of the goal. The second thing is clarity of roles. And often in partnerships, do you take the time to really articulate what are the roles, who's going to do what and how. And then the third element that we've talked about as we think about what makes a successful partnership is putting in place the governance mechanism for nimbleness, for response. As you put together that partnership and you think about the goals and you think about the roles, hopefully you've done a great job. But the good news is in the world that's changing, you'll never have thought of everything. So making sure that you have an ability for you to come back when there are things that are changing and doing that. And that's actually takes time, and you have to do it in very specific terms. And so I think that's one of the things that folks struggle with, both in the academy and in the government, where we both have had experience in terms of creating partnerships. But there are some examples of successful ones.
So at K-State, we've got several partnerships with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've got a new national lab going up there, the National Bioagro-Defense Facility, which is currently under Department of Homeland Security. That is supposed to change to USDA here when the doors open in a couple of years. We'll see how that works, but that's another opportunity for partnerships. We're trying to leverage that right now, not just for Kansas State, but for the nation. This is a national lab dealing with the worst animal diseases and the zoonotic diseases like Ebola. And it's going to take all of us, and it's not just going to be the animal part. I mentioned Ebola, it's going to be the human health piece as well. So how do we leverage all that? What are the ground rules? How how are we going to do this to get maximum effect out of it and get maximum knowledge out of that great expenditure.
And that kind of leads us into biosciences, and as we think about some of those topics, and sort of reversing back to my experience in government at HHS and starting to build these partnerships and the kind of partnerships that are creating economic development as well as advancing science in the way we need to. And a specific example I would give there is in the area of cancer. And this came out and became more public when the moonshot conversations were talked about. But the idea that different research and different actually pharmaceutical companies would work together in the cancer space, because for cancer, often the treatments are cocktails. So it's a mix of different drugs. You have one element, but another company has another. And figuring out ways to bring things together so that you could do the research in ways that we figure out what are best for the patients, and creating an ability to do that. And the National Cancer Institute at NIH was able to do that, and do that in ways that were pre-competitive, so that you were doing it in ways that actually benefited both the research and didn't endanger the companies in terms of things that they wanted to protect. And so as we think about it, but it takes time and energy, and you do have to, as I was describing before, put together the correct protocols to do that. But those are some of the examples, and you can imagine what kind of growth that creates. And I think it leads us into some of the areas in bioscience around things like precision medicine, individualized medicine that will take from different pieces and parts. But there are also opportunities in the threat space.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, Sylvia and I, about food safety and security. And I think one of the things that we haven't talked too much about today or last evening was the threat to some of this. And so the threat to our food chain, and whether that's natural threats, which are out there every day, anthrax and so on, or somebody taking pathogens and then mobilizing them for their advantage, terrorism or whatever. And I think that needs to be part of this conversation. I think the research that's done in academia, probably every university here does something around food safety and security. I'm pretty sure of that. But I think that can play into our competitiveness too, because we've got to protect what we have. And whether it's economic impact because your agricultural infrastructure is so vulnerable, or whether it's coming up with cures for some of these diseases that inhibit production for being as efficient as it can be. I think those are things that we have to think about as we go forward and all collaborate on.
And I think Ebola or Zika are two very specific examples of the kinds of threats that can actually hurt and harm competitiveness. When we go back to the Ebola issue, and for any of you who are in the airline industry, in terms of what was happening there, and whether it was prohibiting people wanting to prohibit people coming from countries, or the cost that it took for us to set up checking at the borders in terms of questions and questionnaires, and the cooperation with industry that was required to do that, and then the fear that occurred. Many of you may or may not remember the gentleman who contracted Ebola who had been on the New York subway. And Ebola, we were in one way very fortunate, because Ebola actually has to be spread by touching or passing a bodily fluid of some type. It's not airborne. The real dangerous one and the real threat is if we have something that is airborne. And when you think about what that will do economically in terms of an interconnected world. And so as universities, working with the private sector and others, how we think about getting in front of the threats as well as taking advantage of the opportunities is something we think is an important part of both the competitiveness, and though it also contributes to the economy in terms of the research that's being done and some of the things that are being produced, whether those are vaccines and preventative things that are happening.
So Sylvia, we outlined 3 buckets that we were talking about, and we're going to attack a couple of them. Can I move to the talent we produce a little, just for a second? As I was listening to the panel early this morning, the first panel at 8:30, talking about the next big effort by the council. I don't know if this is missing or not, but in the region I deal in, we can have great policy recommendations at the national level, but somehow those aren't trickling down to the organizations that exist in our major cities and towns. They all have civic organizations. They're all trying to do things. But when I go to them for help, so what kind of talent do you need? Where do you want to get your education? What is the pathway? Nobody seems to have a good answer for that, at least in my region. Maybe in your region it's different. And I'm happy, I think K-State's happy to come up with that for our area, but that's probably not going to meet the needs of the private sector or the public sector. You stimulated some conversation back there that I just hope that whatever we come up with at this top level, that somehow we have a mechanism to get that to the various civic councils that try to make us more competitive, but seem to do great reports that then just gather dust. And that's my experience so far. So.
And I think for us as universities, as we think about the future and where we should focus and our competitiveness, which actually our sector is becoming more and more competitive, as price elasticity, we're kind of at the end of that run. And so as we think about it, thinking about what is the future of work? What is the future of learning? And what are the economics of higher education? Both in terms of the value proposition, meaning what is the value we provide, what does it cost to provide that, and who pays? And as we're thinking about competitiveness in the United States, we are one sector, but contributing to large portions, hopefully, because of the research and the issues of the students we're producing and the economics. So those are three areas that as we are considering next efforts, and part of why I'm so excited to be a part of this organization is focusing on, those are the questions that I get up every day and think about how is my university going to be a part of answering those questions in the best way we can.
Yeah, the economics of education, of all K through 12 and higher education, and we grapple with that every day, and there's pockets of knowledge and intellectual effort, but it's not ubiquitous, and it needs to be. We need to think about this in a very holistic way.
And I think we have part of the onus, though, to figure out the economics and be able to articulate them. Because as I said, the price elasticity, to give you a sense, a child that was born this year at a university, ours is a private university, but it gives you a sense, and we're not one of the most expensive. But to give you a sense, to educate that child for 4 years, when they become old enough to go at 18, $660,000. That's what it would cost, and that's just not sustainable. And that's if we keep on the current rate of inflation. I somehow go to sectors, whether it's healthcare or higher education, where the rate of inflation is greater than CPI. I'm not sure if it's something I'm attracted to or something I have a great desire to fix because I was at the Office of Management and Budget. But as we think about it, that's a very important part, and I don't think people necessarily think, as we're thinking about our competitiveness and providing education broadly in the United States, thinking about those kinds of questions, I think are other things that we wanted to add to the conversation in the agenda.
Can I ask you a question, knowing this is unfair because we haven't talked about this being a question, but you know, with your time in government and now at American University and a couple different governance models in both those spaces, navigating the U.S. government in terms of partnerships and so forth, how do you see that in general? We don't have time to go in great depth here, but it's you've had a lot of experience. So,
in terms of the governance, I would just say being the Secretary of HHS is more like being a CEO. Being president of a university is more like being a mayor. And in the government, in terms of the partnership, the silo conversation that we were talking about, getting out of the silos, necessary, must do, and building the muscles to do it are extremely important. And I think conversations like these are helpful to building those muscles, and people that go in and out of government. That's the one thing that I would say. We have so many people here who are in the private sector, but having those folks go in and go out, that cross-fertilization will be one of the most important ways that we transform the nimbleness of government and, for people like us, the nimbleness of higher education.
Thank you.
Thank you.